Welcome back everyone to week 2 of the Snowed In Sampler Sew Along, and I'm hoping you all had a good week last week getting your fabrics planned and your background cut, and now that you've got all that out of the way, now we can get on to the fun part, which is sewing. So this week we're going to make this block up here and this red block over here. So they're pretty easy. It's a good way to get started, kind of ease you into things. And I do want to mention in the videos that I do include some more basic instructions on getting a 1/4 inch seam allowance and a few things like that. And I know a lot of you already know that, but I also know that we have a few beginners with us this time, so I don't want to leave them behind, so I just wanted to include a few of those extra tips. So if you've been quilting a while, you can sneak through some of that stuff. You probably don't even necessarily need the instruction, but it's there in case you do. So I hope you have fun this week making our 2 blocks, and I hope you will post those blocks to social media so that I can see what you're working on and others can see what you're working on. And you can use the hashtag Snowed In Sampler Sew Along, and sew along is just SAL as opposed to those words being spelled out. So let's go ahead and get started. All right, let's begin with our instructions, and what you're going to need is your pattern and some of your fabric that you've selected for the blocks that you're making. Remember, we're making this block right here for this week. But to begin with, you'll turn to page 2, and it tells you that before beginning, what we're going to do is turn to page 10, and we're going to cut out block 9. And block 9 is the little snowflake block. And the reason I have you cut this out ahead is because this takes almost 1 fat quarter. And if you cut very carefully and efficiently, you will have a little strip left over at the end that you can use for some of the details in the block, like some of the bows and things. And I do want you to have a little bit of red left over that you can use there. So we're going to go to that page and we're going to cut out our red fat quarter. Now, as you can see, see if I can get that in the camera, it gives you a little cutting chart with sizes along the side here. And I'm just going to tell you a little bit about how I do that cutting. So first of all, you can see this here. There is a strip of all these F pieces, and they are cut 1 1/4 inches. And I've gone ahead and I've squared off my fat quarter along 2 sides. And then you can go ahead and cut your 1 1/4 inch strip. And I'm doing that little cutting technique that I mentioned last week where I'm cutting on the outside edge of the yellow line just to give myself a little extra to allow for the turn of the fabric. So that will become those F pieces. The next thing I'm going to cut are the C blocks. So there's 4 blocks that are 3 3/4. So if I take roughly 4 times 4, I need a 16-inch long strip that's 3 3/4 inches wide. So I'm going to go ahead and cut that. And the reason I have you cut them in strips as opposed to little pieces is it's more efficient. You're not going to end up with little jaggedy edges cut into this edge along here. You have a nice clean edge to work from. So the next piece is 4 3 3/8 inch blocks. So that's roughly a 14-inch strip. So we're going to cut 14 by 3 3/8. Then I'm just going to push that off to the side a little bit, and then we're going to go ahead and subcut these pieces so that you can follow along with what I'm doing. So from this little strip, we are going to cut 4 3/4 inch lengths. So I've grabbed a smaller ruler here. So this is when you're going to turn and subcut. So we need 4 of these at 4 3/4. Sorry, my camera tripod is getting in the way a little bit here. So there we have 3, and that makes 4. And then we can also cut our eye piece, which is just a 1 1/4 inch square. So we can set those aside. You can label them if you want. Then we're going to cut our 3 3/4 inch long piece. So I'm going to go ahead and square up that back side so I have a nice straight edge to work from. And then we're going to work across, cutting into our 4 3/4 inch or 3 3/4 inch squares. And one more.
So by estimating, I've given myself just a little bit extra in that strip that can be tossed out. So you're going to continue doing that with these different sections and strips. So I'm going to go ahead and cut those, and then I'll show you the fat quarter after it's cut. So here's my red fat quarter all cut up, and you can see the size of the section that I have left over there that you can save for other blocks. And as I mentioned in the video last week, it comes in very handy to use your small rotary cutter, that 28mm cutter, when you're cutting all these small and skinny pieces. And in the previous video, I showed you how I cut strips and then subcut into squares. These will stay strips. And then these sections up here, I cut a rectangle this size to cut these 4, and a rectangle this size to cut these 8 pieces, and a rectangle this size to cut those 4 pieces. So that's your cutting for step 8, or block 9, sorry. Next we're going to cut our pieces for block 1. So this fabric is directional, so that's one thing that you want to pay attention to when you're working with a few of the fabrics for this quilt, is that you cut them going the right direction. So there isn't anything in the directions that talks about directional prints. We just assume that you can see that, and then you can look at the pictures below, say right here, and you can tell which direction those pieces are going, so you know which way to cut them. So I'm going to go ahead and cut that large rectangle first, and I've squared off these 2 ends here. And I always just do kind of a cut like so to get that squared off. I know not everyone's comfortable doing that way, so I'll show a second option for you. But I'm going to go ahead and cut this size here first. So there's my large rectangle there. Then let's give you another option. We're going to cut a 3x5 inch rectangle. And I'm going to use this little twisty mat, which comes in pretty handy when you have to turn things. So this 3x5 inch piece, we're going to go this way. Then you can just turn, whoops, you can just spin this on the mat and then cut it 3x5 inches. So that goes this way. And that way you never have to cut underneath or backwards like this. You can just turn your mat to get your piece going the right direction. As you can see, now I've got all my pieces cut and I'm ready to start sewing. And this block is really very simple, which is why I started with this one first. So for those of you who are new to quilting, we can make sure that you have an accurate 1/4 inch seam allowance before going on to the more difficult blocks. So for construction, you're simply going to begin by joining these 3 pieces together, sewing along here, and do the same with this. And then when you're done, you'll go and attach these 2 seams here. Now, one thing I want to point out is in the pattern, I give you these little arrows here, and those are your pressing arrows. And I give those as a suggestion. Most of the time it's because I want your seams to nest when you sew them together. And in this case, this block doesn't do that, but I have you press towards the little ribbon on the package because I want that to pop out after it's been quilted. So that's why I give you those pressing instructions. And let's talk a little bit about your accuracy here. So after you sew this red piece in between the 2 blue pieces, this strip should measure 1 inch. So because we cut it 1.5 and you lose a 1/4 inch seam allowance on the top and a 1/4 inch on the bottom, that's where you get the 1 inch. So after you sew these 2 seams, I want you to go ahead and measure that and make sure that it's 1 inch. If you're having trouble with your 1/4 inch seam allowance being accurate, there's a couple things that I want to point out that you can try. Now, first of all, I always recommend that you use a 1/4 inch foot. I have a Bernina 1230, so I purchased that 1/4 inch foot, 25 years ago or 26 years ago, whatever, and I've been using it ever since, and that makes a huge difference in my accuracy. The other thing I recommend is that if you have more than one machine, that you stick with the same machine throughout the whole project. I have 2 machines. I mentioned the Bernina 1230. I also have a Pfaff Grand Quilter, and I find that that seam allowance is slightly smaller, just like you know, a scant quarter. So if I switch back and forth between the two machines, I find that my blocks turn out a different size. So to alleviate or eliminate that headache, just work with one machine. Now let's walk over to my machine. Okay, so now we're at my machine, and let's talk a little bit more about accuracy here. Now you can see I've got my 1/4 inch foot on my machine. It's number 37, so I use that as my guide. Some people prefer to get the 1/4 inch foot that has the little black flange here along the edge where you line things up, and that acts as a guide, so you can just line your block up with that. Now I don't use that foot or have it, so I can't show it to you in person, but I know a lot of people love that to improve their accuracy. Another thing is, do you see this little line right here on your footbed or on your machine bed? That is also where your fabric should be lined up before it gets to the foot, and that may help with your accuracy. Now I find that really hard to see, so sometimes I will put this diagonal seam tape made by Cluck Cluck Sew onto the bed of my machine, and you have to make sure that it's lined up perfectly even so that the red line is lined up with the hole or your needle, and then you can use this outside line as your guide when you are sewing. So that's a couple of things that could improve your accuracy. So we're also going to talk about pressing. So in our next step, I'll meet you over at the iron. Okay, so now I'm at the ironing board, and I'm ready to give you a couple of pressing tips. And I think my favorite 2 things about pressing, or favorite 2 hints about pressing, is I love using a wool pressing mat. That's what I have underneath here, and I find that it helps me get my blocks so much flatter. And how they work is, as you're pressing, the heat gets trapped in the wool mat, and it's almost like pressing from both sides. So you have the heat coming from underneath with the piece next to the mat, and the heat coming from the iron that's on top. The other thing is, I love to use a steam tank iron. I have a Rowenta steam tank iron, and even though most irons have their issues, I feel like I'm able to get such a nice laying block with the extra steam that you get from this iron. And I find that I distort my blocks less by using just a little bit of steam. So I'm going to go through a couple of these pressing tips today, just because for those of you who maybe struggle with some of your accuracy, pressing is something that I find, like in my classes, when I look over people's blocks, oftentimes I find that they're pressing incorrectly, and that's what's causing their blocks to become a little bit off. So I'm going to share just a few beginner pressing tips on this first lesson, and then you won't have to listen to me share that again in future lessons. So my first hint is, you're going to give a little steam with it laying flat. That's called setting your stitches. Then what you're going to do is we're going to use just the edge of the iron to press that over. So I'm not going like this over my block, which is what I see a lot of people in classes do, because what happens then, see if I can hold this so you can see, do you see that little extra that's hiding inside that seam? In fact, there's quite a bit hiding, and that's going to cause your block to be many threads off. So if you just use the edge of the iron and just use it to push the fabric in the direction it needs to go, and then a little final press, you will find that there isn't anything extra hiding in that seam. It's perfectly pressed out. Then I want to give one little hint for sewing these sections together. And actually, before I do that, let's talk about your seam allowance. So I mentioned to you that this needs to be 1 inch to know that you are sewing accurately. So I take my acrylic ruler and I lay it on top, and I can see that I'm exactly 1 inch from here to here. And therefore I know my seam is accurate, and I can continue making blocks. If this is not accurate for you, then what I would suggest doing is cut a bunch of 1.5 inch strips and sew 3 of them together, kind of like we have here, except for to, save on fabric. Just cut them each 1.5 inches, and then that middle strip again needs to press out at 1 inch, and just try a few different things until it becomes that 1 inch. So if that involves changing your foot or using the tape on the bed of your machine, and if you don't have the diagonal seam tape, you can always lay down masking tape and draw lines on it. You might want to try cutting a little bit differently, like I mentioned in last week's lesson. When you cut with the outside edge of the line, you just might need to make a few minor adjustments, and once you get that accurately at 1 inch, then you can go on to making more of your blocks. And then let's talk about getting this block put together and lined up. I think, you know, it's a very simple block, but the only thing that I've noticed occasionally is after I sew this seam, sometimes these two pieces are not perfectly lined up. So one tip I have to share with you for that is I just take a pin and I mark. Let's see if that's showing up on the camera. So I'm just marking in this top layer of fabric where it lines up with the red below. So there's that pin. Then you can lay this right sides together and line the pin up with your seam line and then sew. Okay, so there's my finished block 1. And you notice in the instructions that it says the block should measure 8.5 by 14.5 inches. And I try to always remember to give this size, I call it a proof size, in the pattern. And to measure that, you're going to want to lay one of your acrylic rulers down on top of your block and then make sure that it measures the 8.5 by 14.5. And in this case, it took me a 15-inch ruler to be able to measure that. So if all looks good, you can go ahead and make your second block for the week, and that's this one. So we have a blue one and we have a red one if you're following along with the kit and using the same fabrics. So that's all you have to do for this week is make those 2 blocks. Now if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out. You can either do it in the comments on the video or you can send me an email at heather@ankastreasures.com and I will be checking that to see if you have any questions. If you don't, that's all you have to do for this week. And when we get together next Thursday, we will be making these little present blocks. So have fun and see you next week.